A mountain cave in Kagoshima, September 24th, 1877. Saigo Takamori and his followers are drinking sake, reciting poems about loyalty and their eminent deaths. There are only a few hundred of them left. They've been on the run for months. Below, moonlight shines on Kagoshima Bay and the castle that was once his. Flashes of artillery light the encampments below, airburst shells hammering the mountainside. Soon, the Imperial attack will come, and Saigo and his men will die. That's become clear. His army of noble samurai, once so revered they could legally murder the lower class if they felt disrespected, have fallen before an army of peasants with rifles. And within hours, Saigo's men will advance with their swords and die with honor in the old way. The Last Samurai. For 5 years, Saigo Takamori, along with Okubo Toshimichi and Kido Takayoshi, had been at the forefront of reforming the Meiji state and dismantling the samurai as a class. But gradually, Saigo had grown uncomfortable with the reach of social reform. He also increasingly clashed with Okubo, who had centered more and more government powers around himself. Pressured to call a conference that would bring an agreement on forming a representative assembly, Okubo managed to create a body that was largely toothless and stacked with conservatives. His policy toward Taiwan and Korea, too aggressive for Kido, not aggressive enough for Saigo, led both men to resign from government. The three great nobles of the Restoration had divided. So, Saigo retired to his lands in Satsuma. He grew crops, hunted, wrote letters, and spent time with his grandsons. He also swore off politics. Though that in itself was a political statement. And Saigo had already become such a powerful symbol of the old ways that his silence was correctly interpreted as a criticism of the Meiji state, which in his opinion was adopting all of the wrong things from the West. For example, he admired Western military and government institutions, but felt that the private ownership of land would incite greed and cause wealth disparity as poor farmers sold their land to the rich during bad harvests. He favored Japan's traditional feudal model of land division. And possibly because of this, he engaged in another pursuit besides hunting and fishing: running military academies. They were sprouting up all over Satsuma, with samurai students learning artillery, swordsmanship, and Confucian principles. These academies became a magnet for radical ex-samurai who were angry at the central government. The most hardcore dissidents who believed that samurai should keep their swords and top-knot hairstyles that were now illegal, with some even believing they should still be able to execute peasants for showing disrespect. These were the disaffected, the samurai who'd failed the transition to military or bureaucracy, or had quickly squandered the lump of pension that the government had given out in lieu of the traditional rice stipend, or that went bankrupt because they had no skill but fighting. Other samurai formed a new political party, the Popular Rights Movement, which pushed for a more democratic model and a constitution. Sporadic samurai rebellions gripped the country. In several, disaffected samurai stormed castles, wearing antiquated armor and carrying swords just to prove a point. The modernized imperial army had little trouble with them. By 1876, Satsuma had effectively seceded from the rest of Japan. The governor refused to implement land reforms and taxes. Samurai openly wore their swords and top-knots, and the military students were effectively a paramilitary force waiting for the order to rise. Tokyo was worried enough that it dispatched a group of spies, Tokyo police officers, to report on what was going on. But it backfired. The commander of the network got captured and, under torture, gave a dubious confession that his group had been ordered to assassinate Saigo. The prefecture boiled over, and an imperial ship was sent to try to remove ammunition from the Satsuma armory so that it couldn't be used to arm rebels. They were too late. The Satsuma rebellion had started, and Saigo came out of retirement to lead it. But he was careful about his language. Saigo wore his imperial army uniform to show that he was loyal to the emperor, but disagreed with Okubo and the rest of the court. And his stated goal was simple. They would march to Tokyo so he could ask questions of the government. And his army consisted entirely of samurai, carrying swords and seized rifles from the arsenal. Commoners were forbidden even from joining the baggage train. The samurai, with 100 rounds of ammunition each, would carry all the food they would need. His first task was to force the gates at KUMAMOTO Castle. There were only 3,800 imperial troops defending it, plus 600 police officers. Saigo's army outnumbered them 2-1. Plus, he knew their commander, Major General Tani Tateki, a former samurai who had fought with Saigo during the Boshin War. Saigo's army would take them easily. Or so he thought. On February 19th, 1877, the Imperial troops fired the first shots of the war. Saigo unleashed a 2-day assault on the breastworks surrounding the 270-year-old castle, but the peasant conscripts held, withering his artillery barrages, battling against the studied swordsmanship of the samurai with their lug-mounted bayonets. Not to mention, they were cunning. Saigo's artillery would clear a breach in their earthwork forts and then send in a storming party of samurai, only to see them torn apart by landmines. By the second day, the Imperial troops were mauled and low on ammunition, but they had significantly damaged Saigo's forces. They pulled back inside the castle, and Saigo dug in for a siege. For weeks, Saigo lost artillerymen to wall snipers. The February cold froze the ground, and inside the fortress, men were starving, running nearly dry of ammunition. But Saigo's army kept getting bigger, his nebulous mission attracting disaffected samurai from all over. 10,000 men became 20,000. Then the Imperial army arrived to relieve the siege, and Saigo split his forces, leaving 5,000 men around the castle and taking 15,000 to meet the Imperial army. March 3rd, 1877, the road to Kumamoto. In a pouring rain, an Imperial force of 90,000 attacks Saigo's samurai. Men slip on the grass, battling in the mud of trenches and positions. Saigo's rifles, primarily muzzleloaders, are so waterlogged they won't fire, forcing the samurai to fight with blades. Every day the situation worsens. Skirmishes turn to full assaults. The dead stack up. In a 17-day battle, 4,000 men are killed on each side, nearly as many as the entire Boshin War. Then Saigo got word that the Imperial troops had landed in his home city of Kagoshima, which meant that even if he won both the battle and the siege, his army was now adrift. He sent a peace offer to the Imperial army. It was rejected. So he abandoned the siege at Kumamoto, the castle which had held out 52 days, and retreated. Saigo and his forces essentially went on the run. He'd drop off a few units to slow down pursuers with guerrilla tactics before drawing up for another clash. And at times, he escaped encirclement with such cunning that dissident press began to treat him as a Robin Hood-like hero. An old samurai standing up for Japanese values against reform and modernization. But there was no strategy, no objective. This was now theater, a way to prove a point about his own samurai virtue. He was forced to abandon his firearms and artillery and slipped home to stage his last stand in Kagoshima. Now here he was, holding a mountain with 500 men, with an army of 30,000 soldiers below in prepared fortifications. He refused their offer for him to surrender. At 4 a.m., his samurai charged the Imperial army with swords, rushing down the mountainside into the blast of cannons and crack of rifles. They hit the Imperial line, and for a moment, katanas flashed, their swordsmanship driving the Imperials back. But Saigo had been hit, the bullet shattering his pelvis. His second-in-command cut off his head, covering up the fact that Saigo was too horrifically wounded to commit seppuku. Then he turned, and with the last 40 men, charged into the guns once more. It was the end of an era. Saigo Takamori, one of the 3 great nobles, had martyred himself against the government he'd helped create. And ironically, the other 2 great nobles would fall with him. Kaido had died of an illness months before, and 8 months after Saigo's death, ex-samurai assassinated Akubo not far from where Ii Naosuke had died. The samurai were well and truly gone. But their legend endured. Barely a decade later, the emperor would pardon Saigo, holding him up as an example of Bushido and commitment to Japanese values. Such heroes were precious to what increasingly came to replace the old samurai order: nationalism. Soldiers were encouraged to see themselves as samurai, as Japan launched an era of aggressive imperialism alongside the most rapid industrialization campaign in history. And some samurai, unlike Saigo, even navigated that change. Because remember a few episodes ago when we talked about the bombardment at Kagoshima? When samurai with black powder cannons walked into the surf, waving their katanas at the British ship? Well, you might know this one right here. That's Togo Heihachiro. And while only 13 then, in 1905, he would lead a modernized Japanese fleet to crush the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima, showing that while the samurai were gone, their spirit never died. Until next time, everyone. Oh, I didn't see you there, Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Muster, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and Oriels1. It's so nice I can thank you all in one place.